The Jetsons 1963 issue 12. After George puts a marshmallow on the tip of his car and as a volcano steam roasts it for him, I end up wondering why there'd be a sharp tip on a car because it only serves to cause more damage in car accidents. But good for him that he can do this. Jane tells George and Elroy to have a good time fishing, and since Elroy asks where they're going, I have to assume they fish in a different place every time. Elroy says jet flying lures make casting easy. Other than that, the only thing interesting about this boring cliche is that they're fishing in their car. Elroy gets a bite from a fish that's big enough to pull the car, and it finally gets interesting when they're pulled into a fog cloud and fall onto a desert island. They lost the fish and ruined their car and the radio in it. George tells Elroy to get out their emergency survival gear and presses a button to summon a tiny instant survival house, which can summon an instant freezer full of food with a flick of the switch, which wastes space on ice cream. George tells Elroy to put on anti-gravity belt, and he does the same so they can fly, and we see people run over to their house and food, and one of them presses a button to fold up the house and freezer and plans to hide them. Elroy spots them because he's so high up, and George heads for a cave. He walks ahead, suddenly holding a flashlight, and walks into a door that's just painted on. He sees someone open a real door, which is pretty convenient, and he uses the magnetic ray gun to attract them to him. One of them says out of nowhere that he took his food because they thought they were reporters in disguise, even though Elroy's a kid, and they just couldn't take a chance on being discovered, so they took their equipment hoping they'd leave. Thankfully, Elroy gets suspicious, but I don't get told that's why. I thought they just wanted to take their food to eat it. That'd be keeping things simple. Elroy conveniently recognizes the voice of one of them and pulls off his fake beard, and reveals that they're teenage singers, the future version of the Beatles. That's certainly a lot more unlikely. They were hiding here between records because they wanted a quiet rest, but apparently they had to be the Beatles so that they could have a radio for George to call for help with. But somehow they were stupid enough to stand behind him when he was in front of the video phone, so of course they got recognized. And 10 minutes later, the island gets swarmed by their so-called fans, which sadly ends the story with George thinking they'll never get rescued. In the next story, Rosie wonders why a robot's truck is making so much noise breaking down. He's driving a truck with the words Henry's Salvage, but I'm just confused about why he's here. And her already recognizing him doesn't help either. She sees some smoke and says he shouldn't drive it with a full load when he has to get it to a garage. She advises him to leave some things here and go to the garage before it closes. He compliments her and carries out the plan. Rosie says she just likes to be helpful, and since she knows George would get mad if he saw all that trash out front, she has a harebrained idea to try to mix it in with the other furniture in the house and hope he won't notice it, when it'd obviously be better to hide it all in a closet. I was gonna say an attic, but they live in an apartment building, not that it looks like it. But at least her idea would keep George from opening a closet and having all of the junk fall onto him. George drives home and mistakes the junk for his own stuff because he doesn't do the vacuuming. So he doesn't like seeing what bad shape the golf clubs are in. A friend of Rosie calls her and distracts her with gossip she's interested in. At least her liking gossip humanizes her more because she has things she likes other than her job. George pulls the junk in and says the new transformer would fix the vacuum, and later he says there's only a hairdryer and 2 chairs left to go. He really is a talented genius when it comes to technology if he can effortlessly fix all this junk. And that's his first thought when he sees it. It's easy to forget that about his character. He's acting the same way Tails would if he saw this. Rosie's friend ends the call and gets thanked. Some comic space is wasted before Jane calls George dear. She says she borrowed his golf clubs to golf with the girls. I'm impressed that a writer of the Jetsons was able to anticipate that in the future, girls could play golf without anyone treating them differently than a guy trying to play golf. I'd never expect her to do this. She hears Elroy tell Rosie that someone said thanks for loaning her the vacuum sweeper. Rosie says it was kept a week, and Henry recognizes and takes the chair George is sitting on. He says George fixing that junk is going to result in him making more money from it. Rosie says George is a regular Mr. Fix-It, as if she isn't already very familiar with this aspect of him somehow. And somehow he faints at the end of the story. And she says all she did was ask him if he'd mind doing some maintenance on her. In the next story, somehow someone from inside of George's house thinks he's calling her when he said, "Hi, neighbor," and it's Jane. George says his neighbor seems like a nice guy, so now I'm wondering if he's wrong. Thankfully, it really is explained that he just moved in, so that's why he said that and didn't know his name. After our time is wasted, he tries to invite the neighbor over for cards. Somehow he can't hear him when they're so close, and he puts a bridge down between the two towers. And he says that's quite a gadget, which must be because he assumes it's able to stick to surfaces so well that it'll be safe to walk across. How's he impressed when you'd think if even he had it, a lot of people would in such an advanced future? Mr. Afterburner agrees to a card game. His wife tells him to do chores first, and then he asks George for the grass disintegrator. Let me guess, this is the start of him constantly asking to borrow his stuff. That'll be repetitive for a plot. Apparently the guy married his wife for being just like him, because she's the same way, immediately asking Jane for sugar, cheese, and a few of her flowers. It's a surprise that if you Google it, there actually is a brand of cheese called Moon Cheese. She thanks Jane, who relatably looks uncomfortable, and she tells George to get her more flowers. Then Mr. Afterburner walks away carrying his drill, which he somehow didn't ask to borrow first, when that obviously risked getting on his bad side. George notices that he picked all the flowers growing near his house, so he decides to go to the florist, and Mrs. Afterburner gets into his car and manipulates him into feeling like he asked the driver to the store by pretending she thought that was always his plan, when she wouldn't actually think that. He comes home and complains to Jane that she bought a bunch of groceries, and she asks if he bought flowers, and he says they got mixed in with her stuff and he wasn't strong enough to try to find them, which is only remotely believable because he came home with a hurting back. He wonders what they got themselves into, which has to be why he tells Mr. Afterburner that he hasn't gone fishing in years, because that's not true, so he was just lying to discourage him from forcing him to come on a fishing trip with him. He tells George he just wants to borrow his gear. Then he tells his wife he just remembered something, and before they even got to play cards, he grabs his wife's arm and runs away saying he'll have George's tools back in a second. And George tells Jane that he wasn't rude, he just told him he was allowed to borrow his fishing gear. A crash is heard, the bridge gets chopped with an axe by Mr. Afterburner, and George explains that he lied to him that he had 2 contagious diseases, getting him and his wife to leave them alone, and even put their house up for sale, somehow. In the next story, George watches TV at home and sees someone get given money for showing off a home movie. So the story wastes a lot of time with George getting the idea to try to do that himself because he tells Jane, who's dismissive about it, because he's an amateur. The next day, Jane has every reason to tell him off that taking a day off work for his get-rich-quick scheme is ridiculous. It's obvious that if anyone could get a huge check as easily as he thinks he's gonna be, he wouldn't be the only person he'd know about trying to do this, so there has to be a catch. Eventually, a part of their car overheats, and to let it cool off, George has to pull over and park on the planet Exo, even though he was on his way to Venus. And Exo is called the Mystery Planet, as if it was somehow very recently discovered in the future. This planet would only exist if it was just created by witches because they started caring less about being subtle, so Mystery Planet indeed. We know there's not another planet on Earth's orbit on the opposite side of the sun because its gravity would be affecting other planets. Is Exo just that small that it took forever to be discovered on the other side of the sun? Naturally, George wonders why no one ever dared to land on Exo when it looked safe. I guess it isn't. As George starts filming, I hope nothing will happen to the camera or anything like that. He better not be leaving the lens cap on, something any member of his family would be able to see and correct him on. It's episodic, so there's no reason it should be prevented from getting a victory like this because it won't change the status quo. An alien runs away from George as I'm thinking that this planet has to be provided with an Earth-like atmosphere by a magical machine. And this family is so used to that being the case anywhere that they assumed it was the case on a planet no one landed on before. How reckless of them. They logically would have died the minute they left the car. The family gets chased after by aliens with ray guns who lazily all look the same, and George drives away. But his film jumps out of his camera for absolutely no reason, and it creates a hole in the air dome of the spacemobile, when obviously the air dome wouldn't be that easy to break. And George opens the air dome and goes out into space to grab the film, and Elroy lassos him to take him back to the car. All the while I assume everyone's been holding their breath, and that they have plenty of oxygen in the spacemobile to instantly replace what they lost when he opened the air dome in space. Even though we're supposed to believe by modern science that going to too high an altitude would make you black out. I can't believe they were allowed to write something so ridiculous. Judy wishes him good luck, and Jane smartly suggests at least going to work for half a day. He insists that he's better than the average person despite all the times he's lacked common sense completely, proving that he's an idiot. But it's realistic to be arrogant just because of a talent. He drives to the camera supply store, and then tells Jane he took the film to the TV studio from the camera store, and the producer flipped out over his film, because no one ever dared to make a movie like he did. He insists on just being a professional photographer now, even though he has no idea right now about what else to make a home movie about. He was even dumb enough to send his letter of resignation to his boss via the mail rocket. I hate when characters are given the simple solution and just ignore it. It's so predictable that he'll get disappointed because it's so early in the story. Go figure, he gets called and told there's a problem. All George did was videotape his eye because he held the camera backwards. Even though it's been established that he used the camera before. The story ends with George running away and a plan to get the letter back from the mail rocket. Yeah, but if all he has to do to excite the producer is go to EXO and film for a few seconds, then there's no excuse for Jane not telling him she'll do that right now. They had no problem escaping the first time. This doesn't explain why someone as arrogant as George would change his mind about quitting, because earlier he said he would never make the mistake of forgetting to put in the film again. So we just think of this as another mistake he'll never make again and tell him he'll redo the film. It's not like it took days. In the next story, George and Rosie see a news report about robot disappearances recently. Jane gives Rosie the shopping list, and naturally George doesn't think she should go because the plot was blatantly telegraphed. I'm supposed to think Jane has better common sense than George, but it's really only when George is the one being an idiot for the plot. Rosie at least explains that she's too brave to let a broadcast scare her away into not doing her job. She sure is an overachieving multi-purpose maid. I'm not sure grocery shopping is in a maid's job description, but she's not a regular maid. She waits for the space bus at the bus stop, and we see some criminals in a junkyard spacemobile responsible for the rash of disappearances. One of them reiterates to the audience what their plan involves, with the excuse being that he's complimenting his boss Jake for a clever plan, where they disassemble robots at the junkyard to sell their parts to other robot owners. Thinking this from a robot's point of view would make this horrifying, because it's like going after humans for all of their organs. It's kinda shocking that a plan this dark was allowed in the Jetsons franchise, since they're literally serial killers against robots. So Jake activates the rain cloud machine to effortlessly create a thundercloud over Rosie. And I'm expected to believe robots aren't waterproof in the future, despite the fact that the modern day has invented hydrophobic spray and stuff. I know it was written in the 60s, but they should have had better foresight. She's so rusted that she can't move, and a crane from the bottom of the spacemobile picks her up and carries her away. It sure is convenient for the bad guys that they can put this rain cloud tech in the average junkyard car. Then a couple of teenagers flying over the junkyard have trouble with their old car because it leaks oil into Rosie, letting her get up. She rushes to the tool shed, only thinking about the well-being of the others. She bets that there's some oil in there, and it cuts to all of the robots being able to move again. Rosie heads up to them to turn those crooks over to the police, and it sure is brave of them all to humor her. One of them says he's beeping mad, and extends his claw to grab the spacemobile of Jake and smack it into the floor so hard that the air dome cracks even though it's above the floor. It would have made sense if he flipped over the spacemobile to smack the glass against the floor. Rosie tells the robots to grab them, but for no reason we don't actually see that happen. Instead, the story ends with Rosie telling her family, who just heard about this over the TV, that the police gave each robot a quart of oil for rainy days as a reward. It's not much compared to the cash rewards George got for other criminals. I assume they didn't get better rewards because they're robots. Then there's a comedy page where George somehow decides to confuse Jane by saying he's wearing a tie for protection. He starts driving, and his car starts stopping on him. He ends up spinning his bow tie, and it magically creates enough wind to send his car flying ahead, even though the bow tie is still on him in the middle of the car, when a propeller should be at the end of the vehicle to push it better. It's like having a sailboat with a fan on it blow itself. It would need a really huge amount of wind to actually blow its own sail successfully. The first story was about George and Elroy trying to go fishing and getting stranded on an island, and revealing that they've got an instant freezer full of food that they can summon at a moment's notice, and it gets stolen. But Elroy notices because he was flying with his shoes. And eventually, he and George get access to a radio to contact home because the thief wasn't what he looked like and was a celebrity instead, by some crazy coincidence, just to save them. The second story is about Rosie telling the junk man he can leave some of the junk at George's porch because his truck is overloaded with it, and then getting the idea to scatter it in George's house, hoping he won't realize he didn't already own this stuff after all of his time living here, when she could have hid it in a closet, but maybe they don't have them because I haven't seen any. He should have been written to say that he thinks Jane bought this stuff, like from a rummage sale. He fixes the junk, which was a lot of work for him with nothing for him to gain, unfortunately. But it wasn't worth it for the junk man for giving him more money for them. I like that he didn't punish Rosie, but the story had nothing to do with sci-fi. The third story is about George getting new neighbors that want to borrow his stuff a lot, which eventually gets him so tired of them that he lies that he got a disease to get one of them to leave him alone. I wish we saw the moments where he told that lie so we could see his reaction. But this wouldn't get him to sell his house, because he'd think his diseases were temporary, and he'd go to the doctor and find out he never gave any contagious diseases to him and confront him on lying to him. So this wouldn't permanently solve the problem. George standing up to him would, because it'd make it clear to him that he isn't welcome to take advantage of him because they aren't on good terms. Once again, this plot had nothing to do with sci-fi. The fourth story is about George wanting to make a lot of money off a home movie show by trying to film his trip to Venus, but he only films his eye. I don't know how he managed to get to planet Exo instead of Venus when he was heading towards the sun and not away from it. I assume the reason the sun doesn't blind everyone who flies up to space instantly is that there's something in the air dome's materials that severely decreases the sun's brightness level so that they can barely see it. I can assume Exo was recently created by witches and move on, but I wish that was explained. We know people that can teleport exist in his world after all. He tries to film the inhabitants of Exo trying to go after him, and him flying away. Somehow nobody in the family noticed he was holding the camera backwards. But at least his mistake caused him to change his mind about quitting to be a photographer, when he doesn't know what to film next. The fifth story is about Rosie being arrested by mere water and captured by criminals and brought to a junkyard, only to luck out because oil from a spacemobile leaks onto her, letting her go to a tool shed where there's oil to get the other robots mobile enough to ruin the bad guy's car. I don't know why robots in the future wouldn't be waterproof. I suppose the robot company being too cheap to waterproof robots is a good enough explanation, considering how many there are. But even cell phones can be waterproof to some extent, but they are much smaller than robots. But these are sentient robots, so there'd be some controversy caused by such apathy.